It's come out that Tucker Carlson would like to interview Vladimir Putin. I don't know if this is to break his new record of over 200 million views with Donald Trump, or if he really believes that Vladimir Putin deserves the opportunity to slowly and methodically share with the world his side of this war in Ukraine without any spin and without any filters. What would be your guess is Tucker Carlson's motivation for wanting to interview Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think, Tucker has now developed a great reputation for sticking his finger in the eye of the policy elite and the comfortable bureaucrats in Washington. And so it is a bit of counterculture, but this wouldn't be the first kind of interview like this that Putin's ever done. I don't know if you ever saw the series with Oliver Stone, and Oliver Stone had an extensive, it's like an hour and a half documentary of sitting down with Putin and asking him questions. Why in the world we're not willing to talk and discuss with this guy to get past the propaganda? Because the media has been manipulating the image of Putin for a very specific reason. And we commented on it earlier. As long as you have a conflict and an enemy, you have a justification for asking more, for spending more on defense, and keeping them at arm's length. I out of curiosity, I went through and looked at how the press coverage, did a Google search by year starting 2004 to see how Putin was being portrayed. And it's really fascinating as you go through and look at year by year, the change starts coming after 2008 when Putin started opposing bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. That was one of the major changes of the elimination of favorable coverage of Putin. And then he really became an irritant in 2014 when he intervened in Syria at the behest and invitation of the Syrian government to fight the Islamic rebels that were being funded by the United States and Great Britain. Think about this. We'd been fighting this war on terror, and then we turn around and we're arming the very same Islamic jihadists that have been carrying out terrorist attacks against Americans. Makes no sense. And so when Putin intervened with the Russians in that situation to stop the attempt by the West to overthrow the government of Bashar Assad, then the gloves came off, and Putin was the reincarnation of Joseph Stalin and Count Dracula.
Interesting stuff. You mentioned earlier in this interview that you have some worry about the BRICS nations, coming together, not necessarily to overthrow the United States government, but to make them less desirable for the rest of the world, to make trade outside of the US dollar more common. Have you studied this much, and what are your thoughts on the BRICS nation making this big push right now?
Well, have you ever imagined what it would have been like to be at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire back in 1947, 1948, when the new world financial order was created, when the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and basically the establishment of the dollar, at that time it was still tied to gold, but the dollar became the de facto currency of the world and the aftermath of those decisions taken in 1948. And that world that was created then has been dominating it now for 75 years. It's now changed. When the United States and Europe imposed the sanctions on Russia, they unwittingly started undoing the entire financial world order that was created in the aftermath of World War II, that put the United States at the top of the heap. And the inspiration, BRICS has been around for several years, but it never really had that factor that would cement those five countries together in a concerted effort until now. And once the United States, it was not just trying to impose sanctions on Russia, it was imposing sanctions on China. It was threatening India with sanctions if they didn't do what the West wanted to do. Same for South Africa. And Brazil at the time wasn't being threatened because Bolsonaro was seen as supportive. Well, now BRICS has emerged with the dominant. It's going to be a major force, more so than OPEC, because with the combination of Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, you've got major control of the world's oil, and then the population size of those units, the economic activity of those various countries. It now represents a direct challenge, an alternative to the financial world that the U.S. has controlled. And I think what we're seeing is the end of that U.S. hegemony in the financial world and the emergence of BRICS. Is it going to be smooth sailing going forward? Heavens no. But what it means is there will be an alternative, and the reign of the U.S. dollar is coming to an end.
Yeah. Yeah, my big worry, I talked about this on my show, I think about a week ago. My big worry isn't the immediate overthrow of the US dollar, but how these guys could collectively manipulate commodities like food and oil and gold and silver that would make life very expensive here, right? Like, think how powerful OPEC is on your wallet when it comes to gas prices, right? Saudi Arabia says, we're going to pump 1 million barrels less. And then like 30 days later, now I'm paying $4.20 a gallon. That adds up very, very quickly. So that was my bigger worry was, not that they would collapse the dollar or the power of the United States immediately. Like, superpowers take a long time to take down, but could they make life very, very expensive for Americans? That was my bigger worry.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, because when number one, Russia is the number one country in the world with natural resources, not just oil, not just gas, not just the nitrogen for fertilizer, not just nickel, aluminum, gold. Just go down the list. They've got everything they need. They've got rare earth minerals that they can do production domestically without having to once turn to someone on the outside. And now that you've bridged this gulf that separated Saudi Arabia and Iran, really for the last 40 years, since the rise of the Ayatollah in 1979, the Saudis have always been very leery, worried about the Iranians, because the Saudis are Sunni Muslims, the Iranians are not, and so by virtue of that religious difference between Iran and Saudi Arabia, you found that in Saudi Arabia, the majority of the oil workers were connected to Iran's version of Islam. And so that was an underlying tension. So a key part of U.S. policy throughout that period was to keep Saudi Arabia and Iran at odds. That was one of the reasons the United States was backing the Saudis in the war in Yemen. And so you round up with the Sunni Shia Muslim conflict. Well, now once Russia and China reconciled and began to create strong agreements, military, economic, political, that then opened the door where China intervened and brought about a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. All of a sudden, they're not at odds with each other. They're working together. They've reopened diplomatic relationships. So all of that, it comes back to your point that now that they're in a position to control with Russia a significant portion of the oil market and determine what the United States pays or doesn't pay for oil. And on top of that, when you look at the United States, Biden exhausted the strategic oil reserve or petroleum reserve in order to get a temporary boost in his popularity last year by reducing the price of gas. Well, that gas prices are now going back up, and there's no more surplus in the strategic petroleum reserve. And this union now with BRICS it's going to be an extension of OPEC. The only significant country, I think, OPEC nation that's not going to be part of that lash up right now is Nigeria. But Venezuela is sympathetic to BRICS and is wanting to become a member of BRICS. So again, when you put all of these commodity nations together, in the past, the U.S. could control it because they had to sell their petroleum in dollars. BRICS is now saying, no, that's not going to happen going forward. We're going to do it our way. That, that's why, I mean, we are living through a moment in history that's as consequential as anything that happened after World War II with the establishment of the UN and the international financial order.
Hey, it's Stephen Gardner. Sorry to interrupt this interview. I promise it only gets better, but I wanted to stop for just a second to tell you about Miles Franklin Gold and Precious Metals, because this is where I buy my own gold and silver. The truth is, the US government is out of control. They've printed over $7 trillion in the last few years, which has devalued the US dollar. On top of that, we are losing our basically strength around the globe. We have the BRICS nations now trying to wipe out the US dollar and make life significantly more expensive. This is why gold and silver is so good, because it holds value and it's outperformed many sectors of the US stock market over the last 20 and even 30 years. Now, Miles Franklin has the best prices. I promise you, I have looked around, and no, they don't offer you free silver and gold for signing up because they don't rip you off. They just have the best prices. So send an email to the email down below, and also check out their website and make sure to let them know that Stephen from YouTube sent you so that you can get the best prices. All right, let's get back to this interview.
Two more areas I want to cover with you. I don't know how much you know about NASA, but you recently wrote an article about how NASA hasn't really done much since the moon missions, yet US taxpayers fund billions and billions and billions of dollars over decades of time to NASA. Meanwhile, billionaire Elon Musk helped astronauts get to the International Space Station. I believe this is the first time that we've been able to do that in a very long time. Most Americans don't realize all of our astronauts going into space lately are through Russia or from China. So what do you think is going on with NASA, and how pivotal will Elon Musk be for future space exploration, possibly war and satellite communication, things like that?
I think, candidly, NASA is a bureaucratic irrelevancy anymore. It's not been effective for more than 20 years. Remember, it was if I recall correctly, the United States asked Russia starting in 2004 to carry our astronauts to the International Space Station, and that agreement, that operation, has remained in place up until about 3-4 years ago with the emergence of Elon Musk in the private sector. Now, some say, oh, well, the United States is doing great. See, we got Elon Musk. Well, Elon Musk is a South African import, number one. And number two, he is a private business. Some of it's publicly traded. But, that is not a result of government activity, government operation. It's just a reminder that now you're getting things done in the private sector that aren't getting done by government. Candidly, I think NASA should probably be disbanded. It's no longer, it's spending money and not producing any results. Yeah, those results are coming from the likes of Elon Musk now, and Jeff Bezos is trying to get into the game as well. Yeah. So, it's just most Americans don't realize that, Russia's been our Uber driver for the last 18 years.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? It's just shocking to me. Okay, last question, I'll let you go. I don't know how closely you've been watching the Maui, Hawaii fire crisis situation. Right. I've watched as much as I could. But then I go onto platforms like TikTok, where there's independent journalists, and they're pointing out really fascinating things that on the surface appear to be conspiracy theory. Then you look into them and there's a lot of truth behind it. Kind of freaks me out a little bit. Do you think that there's any kind of foul play going on in Hawaii, or is this just really poorly executed emergency management?
I think it's the latter. Number one, they've had wildfires there before. What has happened is and Hawaii is just symptomatic of a broader illness throughout American society, where people are being hired and put in positions of responsibility, not because they're the most competent, not because they're the most skilled, but either because they have the right racial makeup or the right ideological makeup, or a combination of those two. And the simple facts about crisis management is, particularly when you're facing a wildfire, anybody with rudimentary experience of that knows you do not order people to shelter in place. You tell them, get the hell out, run for your lives.
Yeah.
Well, the Hawaiian, the guy in charge of emergency management there in Hawaii did just the opposite. They gave a shelter in place order, which led to the deaths. Again, I've been in contact with some of the emergency workers there. They're still insisting that the deaths are over 1,000, because part of what's happening is Hawaiian authorities have said, if we can't recover an intact body, we're not going to count it. Well,
What?
Yeah, I'm not making this up.
So this is where they come up with the 104 people have died on CNN every day. But
right.
Really, there's almost everybody who's doing independent journalism is saying that the numbers are much, much higher.
Correct. And they were this one individual. I mean, we had a mutual friend to put us in contact, and he started, just dumping on me the fact that the police blocked the exits of people trying to flee, so that they were not able to get out of town, and they were trapped and burned to death. It was a complete failure of leadership from the police, from the emergency management, from the mayor's office and the governor's office. This wasn't some conspiracy. This was just complete ineptitude. And you can make a mistake if you're building your own model airplane. You can make a mistake on that. You can always go buy a new model airplane and start over. These kinds of mistakes that cost lives. Yeah. And my acquaintance, this emergency worker, was just describing the horror scene, because what happened is many of these families, there were entire families together, that as the fire approached, they ran into the bathroom, tried to get into the water in the bathtub to save themselves. And he said they were finding entire families clustered together, burnt to death. Just
because they turned off the water.
Yeah, they turned off the water.
They turned off the water. They blocked the only road out of town. People were being forced into the ocean. They didn't sound the emergency siren because they didn't want people to panic that a missile was coming in. Well, when there's a fire, you want panic, so people run away. Humans are smart enough to know, run away from the fire that looks like a wall coming out of Satan's palace. Like, run. And they didn't know what to do.
Yeah, that's exactly. This was not a failure of the federal government per se, but this was really state and local government failed its citizens in Hawaii, and the anger there is just it's palpable, and it's it's not going to go away anytime soon. And this has been largely a Democrat controlled state, and so it's now really creating some serious questions about the competence of the Democrat leadership there. Yeah. Because these people that died, being burnt to death, and the number of school children, what's astonishing is if you put your standards, say only if we recover a corpse can we count it as a fatality. Do they not understand what fire does to a human body? It turns it to ash. So, this was a massive fire, and, they still say that, the numbers fluctuate between 400 missing and over 1,000 missing. And the people I've been in touch with who are there on the ground said it's closer to 1,000. But you've got the government playing games. Well, if we can't find a body, we can't count it.
Yeah. Well, I wish I knew what to do to be more helpful, fly over there, but maybe I'll look into if there's like a way to volunteer or something, because I've been to Maui and it's beautiful. And I love the Hawaiian people, and it's just tragic. Well, Larry Johnson, thank you so much for coming on our show. We covered a lot of different topics. Hopefully I didn't bounce your brain around too much.
No.
I wanted to get your insight on some of these big stories that are happening in the news. But thank you again for coming on today.
It's always fun, Stephen. Thank you for having me.